My name is Kirk Dunn, and this is the Knitting Pilgrim Talks. I'm an actor, writer, and knitter, and I'm also known as the Knitting Pilgrim. I earned that title because in 2003, I was awarded an Ontario Arts Council Chalmers grant to knit stitched glass, an installation of 3 large panels designed in the style of stained glass windows, which look at the commonalities and the conflicts between the 3 Abrahamic faiths: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They took me 15 years to knit. And when the project was complete, my wife Claire and I wrote a play called The Knitting Pilgrim about my experience knitting stitch glass and my research into interfaith relations. One thing that wasn't covered in the play was the meaning behind the imagery in the knitted panels. So this series explores each section in conversation because ultimately the project is about having conversations with empathy and curiosity about how we understand and sometimes misunderstand each other. Welcome to the Knitting Pilgrim Talks. Welcome to the Knitting Pilgrim Talks. In today's episode, we'll be talking about a section of the Christian tapestry or window. And as a reminder, the way these windows are designed is that the positive images of each faith appear inside the main symbol of that particular faith. So for Christianity, of course, it's the cross. So inside the cross, I've placed positive images of the faith, whereas the icons and the imagery that are outside the cross, they refer to more challenging things about Christianity, things I've got questions about. And today we are going to be talking about one of the sections outside the cross, and it is at the top left. You can see a Star of David behind some barbed wire, and that is a reference to the poor performance of the organized Christian church in response to the Holocaust during the Second World War. Now, there were certainly some individual Christians who stood up to the Nazis. I can think of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, for example, and of course they suffered for it. But the official bodies of the church were noticeably silent. And to talk about this today, I'd like to welcome the Reverend Dr. Stuart MacDonald. Now, Dr. MacDonald is a professor of church and society at Knox College at the University of Toronto, where he has taught the history of Christianity for over 25 years and where he is currently serving as vice principal and academic dean. He has researched and written in the field of the Scottish witch hunt, Canadian Presbyterian history, and he's done a great deal of work exploring the changing religious demographics of Canada. And on a more personal note, back in the day, Stuart was first a camper and then a counselor at Camp Iona, what was then called a wilderness camp run by the Presbyterian Church. And that is where we crossed paths a number of times. So, Stuart, Dr. MacDonald, welcome to the Knitting Pilgrim Talks.
Stuart is fine, and it's great to see you. Thanks, Chris.
It's great to have you here. Now, this question about the church and the Holocaust, how much do we know how much the Christian church knew about what was going on in Nazi Germany, and why were they so reticent to intervene?
It would vary from country to country. There was a war going on, so sometimes it was difficult to know. But they knew something was going on. And while the camps were new, the anti-Semitism and the attacks on the Jewish population were not new. So that was something that was in sight, at least.
Right. And so if this was something, what you're saying then is that the anti-Semitism had been in place and going on, and was that part of the Christian church as well?
The Christian church absorbed, reflected, may have contributed to it in different ways, and certainly over the centuries had contributed to it. So it was part of European society, and because of that, it also came to North America, to Canada and the United States. So symbols of discrimination against Jewish people were possible and present in places like Toronto, and we would not be unique in that way. And then you went in Europe into Germany and other places to much more extreme examples. But the anti-Semitism was very present and present in the churches.
Right. Okay. And what during the war, as the war continued, there must have been more and more messages getting out about what was happening. And how were those messages received? Was there any decision or cry out against this, or was it not until we actually liberated these camps where people saw the full horror of it?
Yeah, that's a difficult question. And again, it's going to vary on who people were and what kind of sources they had. The Pope may have known things that individual Christians didn't. I once talked to one of the Canadian Presbyterian chaplains who was in one of these camps shortly after it was liberated. And it was clear from his reaction many years later how traumatizing this was, and that this wasn't something that was expected. This goes to the power of lies as well. And one of the challenges in the Second World War was the propaganda that had happened in the First World War. And so every side engaged in propaganda, and in particular in the First World War, there were these series of atrocity stories that the way that the Germans went through Belgium, things like this. Evil happened, but the way it was exaggerated. In the First World War, there was this story of a crucified Canadian soldier. That led, when it was discovered after the war that so much of that hadn't happened, I think that led to a understandable skepticism about what people were hearing about in the Second World War, except here it was actually happening. And I think even now, in a lot of our accounts of the Second World War, this is sanitized. We don't talk always about how horrific it was. And so I think knowing the truth of how horrible it was is what we need to do. But I think that's one of the reasons the false narrative of the First World War, I think, caused people to not believe when they should have in the Second.
Right. Okay, I can see how that had an impact. As the war was beginning, so in 1939, in Canada, we had the experience of an ocean liner bringing hundreds of Jewish refugees to Canada. It was the MS Saint Louis, and those Jews were turned away. And in fact, I think the Canadian government has, or the Canadian Immigration Department has since been quoted as saying, about being asked how many Jews they would take. They said, well, none is too many. And I just wonder, what was that? Was that noticed by the Canadian churches, or was it just sort of part of the everyday low-grade anti-Semitism that we basically harbored in this country at that time?
I think it was part of the low-grade anti-Semitism, and I think it was part of something more, in the sense that there was a desire to keep Canada culturally as homogenous as possible. And so any group who was seen to not fit that was to be kept out. So I think it's reflective of the immigration policies in general, but also, and we've seen this in our own time, when you get certain conflicts, certain political parties, groups, etc., can say, we don't want that kind of refugee. Or we can say they're not really refugees. And we go back and forth on that. There's times when we've embraced refugees, the Vietnamese boat people being an example. But we didn't bring in nearly the number of Syrian refugees a few years ago that we might have. There were active steps, and individuals can be wanting to, but if governments are opposed to it, it's very challenging for people to do much. And it is reflective of the ethos of that time, the fear of different kinds of people, the fear of refugees, and we've seen that in our own time.
Right. Yeah. Then certainly the modern politics and refugees does that all plays a part in that as well. And yet, even before any of that history or these modern times, Christians have been persecuting Jews, and some of them have been pointing to the Bible to justify that, and saying that according to the Gospels, the Jews are the ones who were responsible for the death of Jesus, and so they should be punished for that, and that gave rise to pogroms and all sorts of terrible atrocities. I've also heard, and hopefully you can shed some light on this, being a scholar of the church. I've also heard that it said that when those Gospels were written, they were written from a point of view of the writers were trying to portray the Romans in a good light, because they were trying to make inroads into Rome. And how did that perspective affect how the Jews were portrayed in the Gospels?
Yeah, New Testament scholars will probably give a bit more and slightly different answers, but I think the truth is we always have to look at the context in which a writing is written. The Gospels are created in a time when the Romans are on top. And so I think there are places where we can point to and say, Pontius Pilate gets off a little lightly. He didn't have to do what he did. And so I think there are cases you can make there are places where, as we often, depending on the audience we're talking to, can frame things in a particular way. And we all know we're doing it. The challenge is often when people later take it and take that as the way it's always been. I think the other thing that happened is people forgot Jesus was Jewish. And they forget the disciples are Jewish. And so when you have these comments challenging the Jewish leadership in later centuries, they get to be understood as all of the Jewish people, but that would have included the apostles, that would have included Jesus. That makes no sense. And so we have to be so careful how we read these texts. But I think, particularly around Pontius Pilate, I think he gets off lightly, is the way I sometimes say this, even during as we're moving up to Easter and Good Friday.
Right. And in those Gospels, the Pharisees are often referred to as the opponents of Jesus, or the enemies. I actually watched it or listened to a sermon where the minister was talking about the enemies of Jesus, talking to his enemies, and they were the Pharisees. Now, is that a fair representation of who those people were?
No. And this happens at multiple levels. At one level, I think we need to read the Gospels closely. And when we do, we see that Jesus has different opponents, different groups within his own community that he's disagreeing with. That shouldn't surprise us. And our characterization of the Pharisees is not fair. That's a slightly different thing. That's how we have identified what we understand to be their weakness. But that really doesn't relate to what we see in the Gospels. What's actually interesting is there are times when Jesus and the Pharisees are closer than Jesus and his other opponents might be. So he's much closer to them than the Sadducees or the scribes, the lawyers. And so this is a group that he agrees with on so much, yet they do have some disagreements. One of the things that Jesus would agree with the Pharisees is that faith isn't in the temple, it's to be lived in your daily life. You're supposed to live the laws out. And that's something that Christians would agree with. How you do that is where there are some tensions, but I think we need to understand those tensions again in the historical context and within the Gospels.
Right. And when we look at Christianity today, are there people within our faith who are playing that role of the Pharisees, who would be perhaps a little more legalistic, or they be caught up on the rules or those sorts of things? Do we have those people within the Christian church?
I think we absolutely do. I think the big danger is we always want to identify those we disagree with as like that. It becomes the common trope. But I think if we were to look at what is it that Jesus really objects to, and then apply it to our own time, I think that might be helpful. One of the things that I would suggest that Jesus disagrees with some of his fellow Jews on is when the law becomes more important than people. And so that I'm going to be pure, and so any compassion to you that might interfere with me is something I should reject. So I think we have to be careful how we do that. But yes, there are those tendencies. There are those tendencies in all of us to see ourselves as more religious and not see where we're failing. And that's where I think reading the entire gospel and a lot of the parables and the stories really helps us to see what it is that Jesus is uncomfortable with.
Right. Okay. Now, we've got this horrendous history of this relationship between, well, much of the world and Jews, in that we have subjected them to a terrible hatred, anti-Semitism. There really hasn't been anything quite like it, and it's in some ways I've heard it's talked about it as the granddaddy of all hate. How do we go about beginning to address or repair the damage that we have done with this? How can we reach out to our Jewish sisters and brothers and begin to make amends here?
That's a huge question. I think there are some ways that we can think about it. One is to just recognize the reality, and not in a defensive way, to listen to the stories, to hear. I think that's a first thing. I think another is humility, of recognizing that we've understood Scripture in a particular way. Others have read it in a different way. And I think so repentance and humility and a lot of listening and not a lot of talking, I think, is really important, that we just need to listen. And that's not always something that we've been good at. But I think that's at least the beginning. This did not develop a day ago, and it's not going to take a couple of days. We're talking about centuries in which anti-Semitism has just grown within Christianity. And so we need to begin the process or continue the process of moving away from that. But it is going to take time and listening.
And it's very much a thing that ebbs and flows, too. I mean, I would like to think that it peaked, like that the Holocaust was the peak, and now things are getting better. And yet, in the present world, we're seeing these ideas talked about more freely now, and I'm not sure if that's because they are actually becoming more pervasive, or they've always been there and they're just being revealed, or what's happening. But it certainly is not something that, as you said, it's not going away anytime soon, and it's up to us to stay on top of.
And I think there are these, in times of tension, and certainly with a major pandemic, people are anxious, afraid, and those who speak hate seem to get a platform. We also have some great amplifiers right now for hatred. Some of our social media platforms seem to almost thrive on that. People anonymously saying things that they couldn't have broadcast 20 years ago. So I think that's all true. And some of these stories, particularly these ideas of secret conspiracies and groups of people, so often and so tragically, that ends up then those folks end up becoming Jewish, and it becomes an anti-Semitic myth that yet again is recycled, and we have to speak against that.
An excellent place to end it. Thank you very much, Stuart. I really appreciate your being with us here today.
Thanks, Kirk.
If you would like to contact the Reverend Dr. Stuart McDonald, you can reach him at s.mcdonald@utoronto.ca. This has been an episode of the Knitting Pilgrim Talks. We'd like to thank the Ontario Arts Council for their support of this conversation series and their funding of Stitch Glass, and the Toronto Arts Council and the Canada Council for the Arts for their support of the Knitting Pilgrim Show. If you'd like to hear more conversations like this about interfaith matters, stitched glass, and knitting, please check out our episodes at kirkdunn.com or the Knitting Pilgrim YouTube channel.